Hashtag how 2,000 Swiss militiamen destroyed the Habsburg army at Morgarten, 1315. Imagine you're a knight in full armor, riding through a narrow mountain pass. You're part of one of Europe's most powerful armies, and you're about to crush a rebellion of peasant farmers. Victory seems inevitable. Then, without warning, massive boulders and tree trunks come crashing down from the cliffs above. Your horse panics. Your formation collapses. And those peasants you thought would be easy to defeat, they're already among you, moving like ghosts through the chaos, and they know every inch of this deadly terrain. Welcome to Morgarten, where 2,000 Swiss militiamen turned military doctrine on its head and destroyed one of medieval Europe's greatest powers. This is the story of how the underdog didn't just win, they redefined warfare itself. Before we dive into the blood and chaos of that fateful November day in 1315, we need to understand what was at stake. The Swiss Confederates weren't just fighting for their lives, they were fighting for something that barely existed in medieval Europe: freedom from noble rule. And the Habsburgs? They weren't about to let a bunch of mountain farmers threaten their grip on power. This wasn't just another medieval skirmish. This was a clash between two completely different visions of how society should work. Let's set the scene. It's the early 14th century, and Europe is dominated by powerful noble families. The Habsburgs are among the most ambitious. They've been steadily expanding their territories, and they've got their eyes set on the Alpine passes that connect northern and central Europe. Control those passes, control the trade routes, control the trade routes, control the wealth. It's that simple. But there's a problem. The people living in those mountain valleys, the Swiss, they've developed a taste for self-governance. They're not interested in bowing to Habsburg authority. The story really begins in 1291, when three forest cantons, Uri, Schwyz, and Unterwalden, formed a defensive alliance. Now this might not sound revolutionary, but think about it. In an age where everyone answered to some lord or king, these communities decided to band together and defend their traditional rights and freedoms. They weren't trying to conquer anyone, they just wanted to be left alone to manage their own affairs. The Habsburgs saw this very differently. To them, this was rebellion, pure and simple. For about 2 decades there was tension, but no major conflict. The Swiss kept to their mountains, managing their affairs, while the Habsburgs plotted. But by 1315, Duke Leopold I of Austria had had enough. He was the younger brother of the Holy Roman Emperor, and he was determined to bring these upstart mountain folk to heel. Leopold wasn't just motivated by politics. This was personal. The Swiss had been raiding Habsburg territories, and they'd been sheltering people who'd fled Habsburg rule. In Leopold's mind, these peasants needed to be taught a lesson they'd never forget. So Leopold assembled an army. And not just any army. We're talking about thousands of heavily armored knights and men-at-arms, the medieval equivalent of tanks. These were professional warriors, trained from childhood in the art of war. They wore plate and chain armor that could stop most weapons of the time. They rode massive war horses bred specifically for battle. They carried lances, swords, and shields. They were the elite of medieval warfare, and they knew it. By some estimates, Leopold commanded anywhere from 3,000 to 9,000 men. The exact number is debated by historians, but what's clear is that he had a significant numerical advantage and an overwhelming advantage in equipment and training. Facing them? About 2,000 Swiss militiamen. These weren't professional soldiers. They were farmers, herders, and craftsmen. They didn't have fancy armor. Most wore simple leather jerkins or padded cloth. They couldn't afford war horses. They fought on foot. Their weapons? Halberds, those long polearms with an axe blade and a spike, along with whatever else they could get their hands on. Clubs, hammers, basic swords. On paper, this shouldn't even be a contest. The Habsburg army should roll right through them. But here's what Leopold and his knights didn't understand. The Swiss had something no amount of armor could match: intimate knowledge of their homeland's terrain, absolute determination to protect their freedom, and a tactical brilliance born of necessity. They knew they couldn't meet the Habsburg heavy cavalry in open battle. That would be suicide, so they didn't plan to. Instead, they were going to use the landscape itself as a weapon. The Swiss chose their battlefield carefully. There's a narrow pass along the shores of Lake Egerie, near a place called Morgarten. It's hemmed in by steep, forested slopes on one side and the lake on the other. The path through is barely wide enough for a medieval army to march in column. It's the kind of place where superior numbers don't matter because you can't deploy them effectively, the kind of place where heavy cavalry, which depends on space to maneuver and charge, becomes a liability rather than an asset. The Swiss knew this terrain like the back of their hands. They'd grown up hunting in these woods, herding cattle through these passes. They knew every boulder, every tree, every hidden approach. On November 15th, 1315, Leopold's army marched toward the Swiss territories. They were confident, perhaps overconfident. They were going to punish these rebellious peasants and restore Habsburg authority once and for all. Leopold probably imagined a quick campaign. March in, scatter the Swiss militia, burn a few villages to make the point clear, and march home victorious. He had no reason to doubt success. His army was larger, better equipped, and led by experienced nobles who'd spent their lives training for war. The Swiss were waiting. They'd positioned themselves on the slopes above the pass, hidden among the trees and rocks. They'd spent time preparing the ambush site, loosening boulders, cutting logs, creating makeshift barriers. Everything was ready. All they needed was for Leopold to take the bait and march his army into the killing ground. And that's exactly what happened. The Habsburg army entered the pass in a long column. This is crucial to understand. When you're marching through a narrow defile, you can't maintain the kind of broad formation that makes cavalry effective. Your army gets strung out. The front is separated from the rear by hundreds of yards. Communication becomes nearly impossible. And if something goes wrong at the front, the troops in the back have no idea what's happening. Leopold's vanguard, his leading troops, pushed into the narrowest part of the pass. They were probably feeling uneasy. Any experienced warrior knows that marching through terrain like this is dangerous. You're vulnerable to ambush. But they trusted in their armor, their training, and their numbers. That trust was about to be shattered, literally. The Swiss struck with devastating suddenness. From the slopes above they began rolling boulders and logs down onto the Habsburg column. Picture the scene. You're a knight in heavy armor, riding a horse through a narrow pass, and suddenly massive rocks are bouncing down the mountainside toward you. There's nowhere to go. The lake is on one side, the cliff on the other. Your horse panics. Knights in full armor are toppled from their saddles, men are crushed, the carefully ordered column dissolves into chaos. And then, before the Habsburgs can recover, the Swiss militiamen are among them. They come pouring down the slopes, moving quickly and surely on terrain they know intimately. They're carrying those halberds, which are perfect for this kind of close-quarters mountain fighting. A halberd isn't just an axe on a stick. It's got a hook on the back of the blade that's designed to pull knights off their horses. It's got a spear point on top for thrusting. And that axe blade can punch through armor, or at least deliver devastating blunt force trauma. The Habsburg knights found themselves in a nightmare scenario. They couldn't form up. They couldn't charge, which is what cavalry does best. Their horses were slipping and panicking on the steep, uneven ground. Their armor, which should have been their greatest protection, was now a burden. When you're in heavy plate and chain mail, you're incredibly well protected, but you're also slow and you tire quickly. If you get knocked down, getting back up is a struggle. And the Swiss weren't giving them time to recover. The Swiss fought with a combination of tactics that the knightly class simply wasn't prepared for. They worked in teams, which was unusual for the time. While knights were trained for individual combat and personal glory, the Swiss fought as cohesive units. One man would use his halberd to hook a knight and pull him from his horse. The moment the knight hit the ground, other Swiss would close in, attacking from multiple angles before the knight could regain his footing. Against an unarmored opponent, a knight in plate mail is formidable. Against multiple determined attackers with armor-piercing weapons, working together on difficult terrain, that same knight is vulnerable. The discipline and coordination the Swiss displayed at Morgarten was remarkable, especially for a militia force. This wasn't a disorganized peasant mob. These men had trained together, lived together, and they trusted each other completely. They knew their lives and their freedom depended on fighting as a unit. There was no room for individual heroics. It was about executing the plan and supporting your neighbors. Meanwhile, the Habsburg column was in complete disarray. The front of the column was being massacred. The middle was trying to figure out what was happening. The rear hadn't even realized they were under attack yet. Leopold tried to rally his forces, but in that narrow pass, with the Swiss controlling the high ground, there was nothing he could do. The very size of his army, which should have been an advantage, became a liability. Thousands of men were packed into a space where only the ones at the front could fight. And those men were being systematically destroyed. Some Habsburg soldiers tried to fight their way forward, others tried to retreat. This just created more confusion. Horses and men stumbled into the lake, soldiers were trampled by their own comrades. The Swiss kept up the pressure, never giving the Habsburgs a moment to regroup. They'd dash in, strike and fade back into the forest before the armored knights could respond effectively. It was guerrilla warfare before the term existed. The battle, if you can even call it that, was over in a matter of hours. It was less a battle and more an execution. The Habsburg army was shattered. Exact casualty figures are hard to come by. This was the 14th century after all, but chronicles suggest that 1,500 or more Habsburg soldiers died at Morgarten. The Swiss losses? Minimal. Some sources suggest only a dozen or so killed. The disparity is staggering. Duke Leopold himself barely escaped with his life. He had to flee the battlefield, abandoning his army and his ambitions. For a man of his station, this wasn't just a military defeat, it was a profound humiliation. The flower of Austrian chivalry had been destroyed by mountain peasants. The psychological impact was immense. But here's where the story gets even more interesting. Morgarten wasn't just a one-off victory, it was a template. The Swiss learned from this battle, and they refined their tactics. Over the following decades and centuries, they became feared throughout Europe as the most effective infantry force on the continent. Those halberd-wielding militiamen evolved into the famous Swiss pikemen, who dominated European battlefields well into the Renaissance. The lessons of Morgarten were clear. Terrain matters, discipline matters, fighting as a coordinated unit beats individual prowess. These principles might seem obvious now, but in an age dominated by the cult of knightly individualism, they were revolutionary. The Swiss proved that you didn't need noble birth or expensive equipment to be an effective soldier. You needed training, courage, and the willingness to trust your fellow fighters. The political consequences of Morgarten were just as significant as the military ones. The Habsburg defeat strengthened the Swiss Confederation immensely. More cantons joined the alliance, seeing that these mountain folk could actually defend themselves against Europe's greatest powers. The Confederates formalized their alliance further and began to develop the institutions that would eventually become Switzerland as we know it today. The Habsburgs didn't give up immediately, of course. There would be more conflicts, more attempts to bring the Swiss under control, but Morgarten had changed the calculus. The Swiss had proven they could win, and that knowledge was powerful. Each subsequent Habsburg attempt to subdue them faced not just military resistance, but the memory of Morgarten, the knowledge that the Swiss could and would fight with devastating effectiveness when their freedom was threatened. Let's take a moment to think about what made the Swiss so effective. First, there was their motivation. They weren't fighting for pay or plunder or abstract concepts of honor. They were fighting for their homes, their families, their way of life. That kind of existential motivation creates a level of determination that's hard to match. When you're fighting for survival and freedom, you don't break easily. Second, there was their social structure. The Swiss communities were relatively egalitarian, especially compared to the rigid hierarchies of feudal Europe. When everyone has a stake in the outcome, everyone fights harder. The Swiss militiamen weren't peasants fighting for some distant lord. They were free men fighting for themselves and their neighbors. That creates unit cohesion and morale that conscripted feudal levies simply couldn't match. Third, and this is crucial, the Swiss learned from experience and adapted their tactics. After Morgarten, they didn't rest on their laurels. They continued to train, to develop their fighting techniques, to study warfare. They institutionalized what had worked and improved on it. This process of continuous improvement is what eventually made them the premier mercenary force in Europe. Yes, the descendants of these freedom-loving militiamen eventually became Europe's most sought-after hired soldiers. But that's a story for another time. The Battle of Morgarten also tells us something important about military history. Technology and equipment matter, but they're not everything. The Habsburg knights had the best armor, the best weapons, the best horses that money could buy. They'd trained their entire lives for war, and they lost, catastrophically, to farmers with basic weapons. Why? Because the Swiss understood that war isn't just about equipment. It's about using the right tactics, in the right place, at the right time. This is a lesson that's been relearned throughout history, from the Greek hoplites stopping the Persian Empire at Thermopylae, to the Vietnamese defeating technologically superior forces in the 20th century. History is full of examples where determination, knowledge of terrain, and tactical flexibility beat superior technology and numbers. Morgarten is one of the clearest medieval examples of this principle. There's also something deeply appealing about the Morgarten story. It's a classic David versus Goliath narrative. The underdog, fighting for freedom against overwhelming odds, using intelligence and courage to overcome a more powerful enemy. These stories resonate because they speak to something fundamental in human nature. We want to believe that determination and ingenuity can triumph over brute force. We want to believe that freedom is worth fighting for, and that ordinary people, when pushed, can achieve extraordinary things. The Swiss at Morgarten embodied all of this. They weren't superhuman. They were scared far. Moors facing professional killers in armor, but they had a plan, they had each other, and they had something worth fighting for, and that was enough. In the years following Morgarten, the legend of the battle grew. It became a foundational myth for Swiss identity, a story told and retold to remind each generation where they came from and what their ancestors had achieved. Was every detail of the story perfectly accurate? Probably not. Medieval chronicles weren't known for their rigorous fact-checking, and national myths have a way of growing in the telling. But the core truth of Morgarten is undeniable. A small force of Swiss militiamen defeated a much larger, better-equipped Habsburg army through tactical brilliance, terrain advantage, and sheer determination. Today, there's a monument at Morgarten commemorating the battle. Visitors can walk the same ground where those Swiss militiamen waited in the trees, where Leopold's knights rode to their doom, where the course of Swiss history was changed in a few brutal hours. Standing there, looking at the narrow pass and the steep slopes, it's easy to understand how the battle unfolded. It's easy to see how the terrain itself became a weapon in Swiss hands. Morgarten reminds us that history isn't just made by kings and emperors. Sometimes it's made by ordinary people who refuse to accept the world as it is and are willing to fight for something better. The Swiss at Morgarten weren't trying to conquer anyone. They just wanted to be free, to govern themselves, to live according to their own traditions. And when one of Europe's great powers tried to take that away, they fought back with everything they had. The battle also raises interesting questions about the nature of military power. The Habsburgs represented the established order, the feudal system that had dominated Europe for centuries. They had wealth, prestige, professional soldiers, all the advantages that system could provide. The Swiss represented something new, or perhaps something old that was reasserting itself. Communities of free men, governing themselves, defending themselves. And at Morgarten, the new defeated the old. This wasn't just a military victory, it was a statement. It said that the feudal order wasn't invincible, that peasants and townsmen could organize, could fight, could win. That message resonated far beyond the Alps. The Swiss example influenced military thinking and political philosophy for centuries. The idea that free citizens, properly organized and motivated, could be more effective than feudal levies or mercenaries. This was radical. So what's the legacy of Morgarten? On the military side, it's clear. The Swiss developed a military system based on infantry pike formations that dominated European battlefields for the next 200 years. Every major power wanted Swiss mercenaries because they were simply the best. The tactics refined after Morgarten, the close-order pike formations, the discipline, the agres. Scion, these became the Swiss trademark. On the political side, Morgarten helped solidify Swiss independence. It gave the Confederation legitimacy and momentum. More importantly, it gave the Swiss people confidence. They'd beaten the Habsburgs. They could do it again if they had to, and they did multiple times. Each victory reinforced Swiss identity and independence. But maybe the most important legacy is symbolic. Morgarten represents the idea that freedom is worth fighting for, that ordinary people can achieve extraordinary things, and that intelligence and courage can overcome superior force. These are powerful ideas, ideas that continue to inspire people today. As we wrap up this story, think about what 2,000 militiamen accomplished on that November day in 1315. They didn't just win a battle, they helped birth a nation. They proved that a different way of organizing society was possible. They showed that you didn't need to be a noble or a knight to be a warrior. All you needed was courage, discipline, and something worth fighting for. The Battle of Morgarten deserves to be remembered not just as a Swiss victory, but as a pivotal moment in European history. It was the moment when the old feudal order started to crack, when people began to see that there were alternatives to the rigid hierarchies that had dominated medieval life. The Swiss Confederation that grew from Morgarten would eventually become Switzerland, a nation that to this day values independence, neutrality, and citizen participation in governance. The roots of all that can be traced back to a narrow mountain pass where farmers and herders proved they were more than a match for armored knights. So, the next time you hear about Switzerland with its famous neutrality and citizen militia, remember Morgarten. Remember 2,000 militiamen who refused to bow, who used their wits and their courage to defeat one of Europe's great powers. Remember that sometimes David really does beat Goliath. And remember that freedom, once won, must be defended, sometimes at the point of a halberd in a narrow mountain pass. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of history's most incredible underdog victories, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories from history that deserve to be remembered. Drop a comment and let me know what historical battle you'd like me to cover next. Until next time, keep exploring history.